Right, boxing gossip here. Thursday night in February. And I'm looking ahead to some of the key questions in the soon-to-be-announced Kell Brook versus Errol Spence fight. I think there are 5 key questions here that will have a big determining factor in this fight. Key questions. Now, I was going to record this video last week actually, and if I did, one of the key questions I was going to put down is location. Where will the fight actually be held? Because I believe that it's a substantial advantage for Kell Brook that the fight's in the UK. But we covered that yesterday on the podcast, so I'm not going to go over that particular area in any length. And I'm going to talk about the 5 still remaining questions that exist in my mind now we know that the fight's going to be in the UK. So the first question, and for me it's a very, very, very key question, is how is Kell Brook going to make this weight? Kell Brook is now in his 30s. Kell Brook was, I believe, a light heavyweight at the time of the 30-day check weigh-in with Gennady Golovkin. My estimation is that Kell Brook has been as high as 185, 190 between fights. This is a guy who blows up massively between fights. This is a guy who has to cut a lot of weight to make weight. And now he's getting older. Now he's had the experience of putting on muscle for a fight with Golovkin. Now his body is used in his last fight to making 160 rather than 147. I believe it's going to be really, really, really difficult for Kell to get down to 147. I was standing right next to Kell Brook at the Eubank fight a few weeks ago. And at the time, he didn't look like a welterweight to me. He really didn't look like a welterweight to me. He didn't look the leanest. And he looked physically strong. The guy's muscular. The guy's got thick arms. The guy's got arms the size of a middleweight. I'm not saying necessarily his frame is a middleweight frame in terms of his height and that sort of thing, but he's got muscle on him. He's got fat on him. His body made 160 in the last fight. He's always struggled at 147, and that's only going to get more and more and more difficult for him, especially as he gets older and potentially as he gets more muscular. I genuinely believe this will be the hardest weight cut of Kell Brook's career, and it's going to be such a determining factor in this fight. For me, it's one of the single biggest reasons to actually think Errol Spence could win this fight. And that's no discredit to Errol Spence, but I actually think Errol Spence could win this fight on the scales. Firstly, I'm not 100% sure Kell Brook even makes the weight. Does he actually have the capability of getting his body down to 147? Big question for me. Secondarily, if he does get it down to 147, will it inhibit his performance so substantially that the fight swings massively in Errol Spence's favour? Will Kell Brook be able to fight 12 rounds, having cut the weight? Will Kell Brook be able to deal with a body puncher like Errol Spence having cut the weight? Will Kell Brook deal with someone who puts the pressure on like Errol Spence, having had to cut the weight? I think it's a real key question. And I think it is one of these fights where the weight could be the answer to how this fight actually goes. Eddie Hearn says he believes Kell Brook would probably be better at 154. I suspect that's actually correct. I know Eddie Hearn gets a lot of stick and a lot of hate, but I actually think he's probably right, on this particular occasion. I don't think it's going to see Kell Brook in his best light being at 147. Whether it's bad enough to make him lose the fight on its own, I'm not sure, but that is a key question. Secondarily, has Kell Brook been cobra'd, or perhaps more accurately, has Kell Brook been Golovkin'd? Brook took a bit of a beating in the last fight. I appreciate it was competitive at spells. I can appreciate it only lasted 4 or 5 rounds, but let's have it right. Brook took heavy punches from a very, very hard puncher and was left with a substantial injury to the eye, a broken orbital bone. Will Errol Spence be able to get early success in the fight by targeting that injury? Kell Brook's had some knocks in his career. We know he recovered from a stab wound. He's now going to have recovered from this eye injury. His body's going to have to recover from cutting all the weight. Is it going to start to catch up with Kell Brook? As I mentioned in the previous point, Brook's not a young man anymore. He's now into his 30s. He's up against a young, hungry lion. Is it possible that Kell Brook is now past his prime? Has he had his peak beaten out of him? Are his best years possibly behind him? I actually think that's a legit question. We talk about fighters getting old overnight, and I know if Kell's 30 or 31, that's not necessarily the typical territory where we talk about people getting old overnight. But I believe sucking yourself down to a weight class that your body can't naturally make and surviving fights and injuries like he did against Golovkin are the sort of things that can make you go old overnight and can see a reduced performance. If Kell Brook looks flat, if Kell Brook looks not the same kind of fighter in there, could it be a weight issue? Could it be a fact that he's still not over the Golovkin beating? I think those are two definite possibilities. Key question number 3, Errol Spence's power. Spence has run through his opponents like a hot knife through butter. Chris Algieri, known as a very, very durable guy, went the distance victorious against Provodnikov, went the distance against Manny Pacquiao, went the distance against Amir Khan. Chris Algieri is not a guy, that prospects just knock out the way and run through. But Errol Spence, absolutely destroyed him. Errol Spence destroyed Chris Van Heerden. Errol Spence destroyed Leonard Bundu. Bundu's a guy who went the distance with Keith Berman, who's considered one of the harder punchers at 147. So Errol Spence has shown, electric power in his career to date. And it's not just single punch power. It's kind of the way he fights, the high pressure, the high volume, the power punches combined with the natural heavy-handedness that makes him such a threat. It's fair to say that this is his first step up to the elite echelons of the welterweight division. He's beaten very good fringe contenders. He's beaten very good top 15 fighters, very good gatekeepers. Let's see how the power corresponds to an elite fighter with Kell Brook. I know I've raised the point that Kell's going to be tight at weight. I know I've raised the point that he's potentially been Golovkin. But let's have it right. Brook was never dropped by Golovkin. Brook has shown no punch resistance problems in his fights at welterweight. More recently, I know there's a few historic claims that Brook may not have the best punch resistance, but he took those shots from Golovkin, and so the good chin there. Some of the punches that Kell Brook took knocked out middleweight. So, let's see what Errol Spence's power is like against an elite level welterweight, and I think that's a big question. The fourth key question, Errol Spence's chin. Errol Spence has never really been in with a dynamite puncher. Now, I'm not saying Kell Brook is necessarily a dynamite puncher, but Kell Brook's the hardest puncher that Errol Spence has been in with as far as I'm concerned. Chris Algieri, Leonard Bundu, these are decent fighters, but they're not known as the hardest punchers. And I think there's been 1 or 2 times that, there's the suggestion that Errol Spence is susceptible to being hit. And I believe he's going to get hit in this fight against Kell Brook. Kell Brook's a good technician. He's a sniper from range. And I believe the way Errol Spence fights means at some point during this fight, his chin's going to be tested. Like Kell Brook, Errol Spence is a big guy at the weight. Spence is a guy who's going to have to suck himself down and cut weight to make 147. And, Spence is a bit less battle-hardened and a bit less tested than Kell Brook. So let's see, we're talking about, is his power elite? We're probably also going to find out in this fight, is his chin elite? So, for me, those are 4 key questions. How will Brook do at 147 again? Will there be after effects of the beating he took at Golovkin's hand? How will Errol Spence's power translate to the upper echelons of the welterweight division? And what's Errol Spence's chin like against a puncher like Kell Brook? 5th one, and this is an important one, because styles do make fights, as they say. How will this clash of styles play out? In Kell Brook, you've got a guy who boxes from the outside. He's at best when throwing long, straight punches. He's got a great jab. He's got a great right hand. Possibly not the most electric inside fighter. Someone who prefers to hold on the inside and close down opponents rather than getting into a scrap on the inside. Possibly not the most versatile. Possibly not the best body puncher. In many ways, I've often thought of a Kell Brook as a Vladimir Klitschko type fighter, albeit at 147. Clearly, he's lighter on his feet and he moves better than Vladimir. He's probably, at this stage, fresher, more athletic type. But, the reason I say that is he's a guy who works off the jab. He's a guy whose money punches a straight right. He's not a guy who's ideally looking to mix it up closer to the body. If it's up close, we're going to see a tendency from Kell Brook to try and hold and to try and, close down the action rather than get into a brawl. Errol Spence, southpaw, aggressive, athletic. He's someone who establishes his jab early on, fights from that southpaw stance long, but realistically he's doing that as a way to gain entry to the pocket. Errol Spence is a guy who boxes his way in, but then realistically likes to get into your engine room, likes to exert the pressure, throw large combinations of punches up close. A lot of hooks, a lot of good work to the body, a lot of changing levels, and he's a guy with real snap, real accuracy, and a real presence inside the pocket. Is he susceptible to being caught on the way in? That's a key question. I, at this point, have not yet made a decision who I can pick in this fight. I see strong reasons to pick both men, and being frank, I also see strong doubts over both men. Reasons to doubt both men. People I respect, like Ultratech Sports, I think stylistically he just believes Kell Brook has the key to beat Errol Spence. Whereas someone like Irish Tom on the podcast, really believes Errol Spence is the man in this fight, and believes that, there's so many question marks over Brook with the weight, etc., that Spence is the safe bet. People are saying this could be Calzaghe-Lacey Mark II, and saying that we're going to have an American, massive height, massive reputation, known as a massive puncher, but someone who hasn't really fought anyone, and they're going to come over and get horrifically exposed like Jeff Lacey did. Let's see. I think Errol Spence is a lot better than Jeff Lacey for what it's worth. And I also am not sure Kell Brook is quite the fighter Joe Calzaghe was. But we'll see. I find it a fascinating question, and I find it a fascinating fight. And because I find it such a fascinating fight, I'm going to do a series of follow-up videos examining evidence on how the styles will work out. So I'm going to look at historic fights of both guys. I'm going to look at Kell Brook versus Golovkin. I might look at Kell Brook versus Porter, and a few other bits and pieces of form. I'm going to look at some Errol Spence fights, Algieri, maybe some of the more historic stuff as well. And I'm going to do videos. I'm going to do, we'll call it a 4 or 5 part series. We're going to do Kell Brook, Errol Spence, evidence part 1. And we're going to look at historic fights the guys have been in and analyse those fights, having re-watched them. And hopefully throughout the course of doing that, I'm going to come to a decision as to who I'm going to pick. I'm going to be able to establish preferred tactics and keys to victories for both men. And I'm looking forward to getting properly stuck into this fight and making my mind up which way I'm going to pick, because it's a real tough one. If you'd like to see those videos, make sure you hit subscribe so you can check out my other stuff and get notified when I upload something to the channel. Leave your comments in the section below. What do you think about these key questions I've raised? What do you think are going to be the answers to these questions? Will Kell Brook make 147? Will the Golovkin beating have an effect on his performance? What's Errol Spence's power going to be like at the upper echelons? What's Errol Spence's chin going to be like? How is the fight going to play out stylistically? What's that actually going to look like in the ring? Leave your comments below. If you've enjoyed it, please hit thumbs up. Do take the time to subscribe. Many thanks indeed for watching, people. Do appreciate it.